How will we take quizzes in this class?
They'll be in the assignments section, and they'll be available 3 days before they're due. So like yours is due on the 18th, so I'll put it up on the 16th, so you can take it either the 16th, 17th, or 18th. And you just do it in the assignment section on your computer. And
Okay, thank you.
you're welcome. And the expectation is that you're not looking every question up, that you're just answering from your memory. It's the whole idea. So I'm trusting that you're not cheating. I will say, over the summer, I did notice that for whatever reason, the grades were a little higher on the quizzes than the weekly questions. But the truth is, I think your grades should be fine on both. I'm not going to ask you super crazy stuff on the quizzes. And you already know what the weekly questions are, so that shouldn't be too terrible, hopefully. All right, other questions, comments, or concerns? I did get some email from some ACC dual credit coordinator about you going to in-person learning next week, but I don't think that changes our lives any, because I don't think I'm supposed to show up at your high school. So, because I don't know. I don't know exactly how that's supposed to go, but I think they'll probably find a room for you guys to all hang out in, and then you'll all go to that place and turn on your computers and do this together, I guess. I don't know. But because I've had class all day, I really haven't had a chance to read it. So I'll go back and look, but I don't think it dramatically affects what we will do as a group. Because I think the ACC expectation is that we're not in the same spot this semester. I'll double check. All right, anything else that you guys have on your minds before we get started? Okay, I'm gonna look for our notes and share them. There they are. Okay, all right. So last time we talked about why there was a civil war. It had something to do with slavery potentially, or states' rights, depending. Okay, it's both, but definitely, slavery was in there. The South, we talked about how the South grew a lot of cotton, how that was the primary focus of their economy, how that became a problem once their cotton sales to Europe were cut off. When the war was over, if you didn't own a cotton farm, formerly plantation, you probably didn't have a whole lot of economic opportunities, but you probably didn't anyway because it was the South and people grew cotton. Labor source changes slightly in the South. I know that ending slavery is a big deal. It is. I'm not suggesting it wasn't, but a lot of times former slaves worked for their former owners after the Civil War ended. So some things changed, in a big way. There's certainly more rights, and you got to decide who you lived with, and people couldn't sell your relatives. But in some economic ways, there wasn't as much autonomy. Autonomy, is that a word you guys use? Where you get to control your own decisions, that sort of thing. Yeah. And as you're noticing at your age, that autonomy is not very complete unless you can pay your own bills. Your parents have probably shared that with you already. I know my parents did. Of course, I'm back in the day when, you turned 18, they just told you, like, good luck, you're paying your own stuff now, which I think it's probably good those days are over. But in this era, goodness, what we're talking about is something so much more serious, where, people had worked their whole lives and never been paid, and then were freed, but didn't have any resources. So it's a huge problem. All right. And that the federal government tried to help former slaves in some ways by creating the Freedmen's Bureau and some amendments which created some new rights for former slaves, which may or may not be protected by the government. And then we may or may not have talked about sharecropping and the crop lien system. And sharecropping, where you didn't own land, but you were a farmer. I mean, that's what you had learned how to do. So you worked on somebody else's farm, and they loaned you tools and gave you a place to live, that kind of stuff, except, they took it out of your future pay and charged you interest. So it essentially means you're probably going to work for that person forever because you can't get a new job until your debt's paid off, and you're probably perpetually in debt to that landowner. Crop lien system, you own some land, it's probably not terribly productive, maybe like farmland in central Texas. Have you guys tried to grow anything here? Man, it's almost impossible. You dig a hole, there's a rock, that sort of thing. So they had these are poor people that had bad land, and they didn't have enough money to pay for the stuff they needed to plant their crops. So they would borrow against the value of their land and their future earnings to create their future earnings. And that works out okay as long as the crop comes in. If there's a crop failure, then they probably are going to lose their land and become a sharecropper. Okay. All right. So somebody's coming in, but I think I already counted them here. Sorry for the distraction there for a sec. Yep. Okay. All right. So I think we had talked about how Johnson became president. I feel confident of that. So Johnson, oh, I noticed, and I don't know why you guys didn't point this out, but I used these same notes this summer too. In my original notes, if you've already printed them, I put that Johnson was the VP in the election of 1860, but it was really 64, the one right before the Civil War ends. So now I'm not asking anything like that on the test, so it's not super consequential. But you know, if I make a mistake, I want to fix it. So there you go. It's fixed now. So I reposted that really just today. So apologies for the error, but it's not super consequential for your purposes, but you know, for history, we like to be right. So Andrew Johnson becomes president in 65 after Lincoln's assassination. And we talked about how he was from Tennessee, pro-slavery, but definitely opposed to secession. But now he is president during the during Reconstruction. So right after the Civil War ends. And his job is to protect the rights of former slaves in the South, and he has really no desire to do that. So he's not going to do that. Okay, so I think we've set the stage now. And how can you, oh dear. Oh, this is the class where we had all the people make up the stupid names, isn't it? Okay, so let me see who's coming in. Oh, that's just somebody having trouble getting in. Okay, no stupid names here. Yeah, I was thinking about emailing your transition coordinator and saying, you might tell the young people that the sign of college readiness is not how many stupid names you can make up for yourself, but you know it's not. Okay. All right. Sorry for that. One more. Excuse me. All right. So when Congress comes back into session after Johnson becomes president, well, before, I guess we should go back. The Congress before the election was trying to decide how are we going to let Southerners back in, because it was very clear the South was going to lose the Civil War. But they hadn't really decided how we're going to let Southerners back into the government. So they had a lot of arguments about this. Now, President Lincoln thought the South had suffered enough. We talked about this some. So he devised a fairly lenient plan that they referred to as the 10% plan, which meant that 10% of the former Confederates had to swear loyalty moving forward to the Union. And then as long as 10% of the eligible voters did that, then they could have elections and send people back to Congress. The Congress thought that was too lenient and devised something called the Wade-Davis plan, which was devised by two senators, one named Wade and one named Davis. And it's also sometimes referred to as the 50% plan, 50% plan. And that required that 50% of former Confederates had to promise that they had never voluntarily supported the Confederacy. Now, as you can guess, that would be impossible. So some people are going to suggest that the real idea was that they weren't going to let anybody from the South back in until they got a new generation of voters to kind of punish them. Lincoln thought that was too extreme. So this this sorry, this bill ends up getting passed, but Abraham Lincoln thinks it's a bad idea, so he doesn't sign it. Now, toward the end, sorry, there's a super long message that somebody's leaving. I apologize. Abraham Lincoln doesn't want to sign the 50% bill, the Wade Davis bill, because he thinks it's too strict. Now, the way that a bill becomes a law, both houses of Congress have to agree to it, and then the president has to sign it. Now, if the president doesn't sign it, a variety of things can happen. Now, if it's during the legislative session, if a president doesn't sign it during the normal part of the legislative session, if the president doesn't sign the bill, then it just doesn't become a law. Now, Congress can take it back up, and then they can vote to override the president's veto. That takes a 2/3 vote, and that hardly ever happens. It's going to happen a lot during the Johnson administration, but it doesn't happen typically. So they can override the veto, or excuse me, it cannot become a law. The president can veto it, and then the Congress can override the veto with a 2/3 vote. Or toward the end of a legislative session, the president can choose not to sign it, and then it just goes away. Now, that only works in the last 2 weeks of a legislative session. It doesn't work any other time. And there's a provision for that, assumedly because at the end of a legislative session, people become a little more intense, maybe less rational. And the thought is, if the president doesn't want to approve this, then it can kind of go away quietly and they can take it back up in the next session. So what Lincoln chooses to do rather than veto the bill is not sign it and let it go away, which again only works in the last 2 weeks of a legislative session, because normally if the president doesn't sign it, then it becomes a law. I feel like I said that backwards earlier, so apologies. Now, there's no test question about the difference between a veto, a pocket veto, which is where you just let it go away at the end of a session, it doesn't become a law, or when you don't sign it during a legislative session. But what I'm trying to say is Lincoln disagrees with it, but he doesn't want to antagonize the Congress by vetoing it, so he does the pocket veto. And his thought is, when we all come back after Christmas, cooler heads will prevail. We'll find a better compromise that we can all agree on that's probably fair. But then Lincoln doesn't come back after the legislative session because he gets assassinated and there's no Reconstruction plan. So Southern states really don't have any direction on this. The only thing they know for sure is that the Congress coming back probably doesn't want them in, and that they've already said that no former Confederate leaders can hold office. So what Southern states do is they send delegations to see the new president, Andrew Johnson, and ask him for pardons. So lots of former Confederates get pardons, and then they ask if it would be okay if they just had their own state elections and sent people back to Congress. And then Andrew Johnson says, sure, that sounds fine to me. Now, Johnson had not consulted with Congress, and Congress did not approve of Johnson's plan. So when Congress comes back into session, all of these guys come back from the South, and the Congress says, no, we're not having this. We did not want these guys here. We didn't authorize this, and Congress gets to decide who comes back and how they come back, not the president. That is a legislative job, congressional job, not a presidential job, not an executive job. So they just refuse to give them the oath of office. So those guys don't get to be congressmen. And then it starts a really long couple of years of conflict between Andrew Johnson and the Congress. So Congress decides they will pass their own Reconstruction bill, which is going to be, we'll refer to it probably as military or radical Reconstruction. Sometimes it's called Congressional Reconstruction. And in your book, I think it mostly refers to it as the Reconstruction Act of 1867. So what this does is it divides the South into 5 different districts. So it's no longer a bunch of southern states. It's 5 different military districts, and that'll be governed by um, military leaders. So like one of the governors is Ulysses S. Grant. They'll find some others as well. So, excuse me. And those governors will decide how things work in those 5 districts until the states in those districts agree to ratify the 14th and 15th Amendment. Once that happens, then those states will be able to have their own elections, and then they can run things however they see fit. So there you go. All right, now, can you guess how many southern states are going to agree that they like the 14th and 15th Amendments? You know, the ones that say that former slaves are citizens and have equal rights and they should vote. You have any guess about how many southern states think that's a good idea?
Most likely 0.
Yeah, you're exactly right. That would be 0. So none of them ever do. So none of them technically get to reconstruct because they won't, yeah. So this is going to create a bit of an impasse between Johnson and the Congress, and of course with the South. And the South is just going to get more and more entrenched about this. You know, we've all had those moods. I've had them as well, and I'm sure you have, where, you know, somebody tells you until you do this, you're not going to get this. And then you just go like, whatever, I'm never going to do that, and you can't make me. So the South is definitely going to get in that mood, but so is Andrew Johnson. And they're going to end up fighting about everything until Johnson's term is over. So radical Reconstruction starts, and then the South starts fighting back. The way that the South resists the 14th and 15th Amendment and the ideas of radical Reconstruction is they start passing local laws to restrict people's freedom. So they'll reinstate slave codes, only they'll call them black codes. And those will require, you know, instead of that you have ownership papers with you, that you have an employment contract with you. There's certain cities that if you're black, you can't go through them without permission from a white resident, or maybe without an escort from a white resident. Certain jobs you can't have, certain places you can't live. You have to have labor contracts that last for a year. And if your employer doesn't treat you well, pay you the way they're supposed to, you don't get to break the contract unless you can go to court with white people testifying on your side. If you can't, you really don't get to go to court, because while you might be a citizen, they still aren't going to allow you to testify or call witnesses unless they happen to be white. They're also going to say, if you would like to vote, we're going to add a few restrictions for you that really make sense, like a literacy test. Now, on the surface, literacy test does make sense. We want to make sure that you can read if you're voting. However, it wasn't a standard test. So it varied by whoever was receiving the test or whoever was giving the test. So this would be like, if, much more serious, of course, but if you were taking a class, say this one, you're taking a class and I decide, you know, I really like my first 2 classes because they're adults, they're all grown, you know, they don't make up, you know, stupid names with body parts when they sign into the class. I'm just tired of these kids. So I'm going to give the kids, the high school kids, a much harder test than I give to the adults because kids are dumb and I'm tired of them. That would be patently unfair. I mean, that would just be an unfair thing to do. And I'll stop giving you a hard time about the names here in a day or two. But it would be unfair. And you guys would think, well, that's discrimination. It is. I mean, it would be. Well, this is clearly what's, you know, happening with this literacy test, because they're not all getting the same test. Sometimes people's literacy tests, like if I liked you and I wanted you to pass, your test might be write your name and spell it properly. And that would be a pretty standard example of a literacy test for white people during this time period. For African Americans, former slaves, it might be explain the 3rd article of the Mississippi State Constitution, which, you know, sometimes lawyers can't explain that stuff. But here's the truth. Even if you could explain it, they would just say you were wrong and that you didn't pass. in the modern era, because this goes on until about the time I'm born in the 1960s. So this goes on for a long time, and what voter registrars would do would be to throw away the tests and not score them. And it was pretty common as you got into the modern era for voter registrars just to lock the doors and not let African Americans in, or not post the times that they were open. So, I don't know. The voter registration stuff and the literacy tests seem good on the surface, but the way that they were administered was completely unfair. They also pass a poll tax, P-O-L-L, which you were required to pay when you went to vote. And if you didn't pay it then, you had to pay it retroactively, so back to the first time that you could vote. And I know maybe some of you are thinking, there wasn't a whole lot of public education in the South during this time period. That would be correct. So, and there were a lot of poor people, a lot of poor people. What does it mean when you raise your hand? Do you want to say something? Say something.
Yeah, I just have a question. What was that fee called again? For
Oh, poll tax, P-O-L-L, tax.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Sorry.
No, you're welcome. And you should, I don't even know how you raised your hand. I'm impressed. So.
Yeah, you go to participants and then you'll just see a bunch of options.
Oh, I see it. That's cool. All right. I'm glad that I recorded that I don't know how to use Zoom as well. That's good. Like you guys needed more proof of it. So I didn't know the basic stuff. Okay, so poll tax. You're thinking there's a bunch of poor white guys in the South. You are correct. And they don't know how to read it either. Also correct. So the South passed things called grandfather clauses. Grandfather clauses. Those said that if your grandfather could vote before the Civil War, you don't have to take the literacy test or pay the poll tax. And that again will also last through the 1960s. So that's an exemption for poor white guys who can't read either. So that way they just don't even have to go. So, you know, later on, the federal government will decide to help end discrimination, that the control of voter registration needs to be federal rather than state or local. And, you know, history will suggest to you why that's a good idea. I know there's a lot of discussion about that even now because of the mail-in votes and voter ID laws and that sort of stuff. But the reason that those things are controversial historically, I know they may not be day to day, but the reason that they're controversial historically is because, oh, did you mean to raise your hand? I'm
No,
sorry.
I didn't. Sorry. I just
Okay. No,
okay,
you're
sorry.
good. No, you're good. I just noticed it that time. It's like, oh, I see it. Okay. But the reason those things still are controversial is because of how they've been used in the past. So when you hear people say, like, I don't think we should have a literacy test for voting, you know, you're probably thinking like, no, that's cool. You should be able to read to vote. Yes, but in the past it's been used in a way to keep people from voting. Same with voter IDs, and same with, there's lots of other things that that's the same. So I'm not necessarily saying that we shouldn't, you know, bring certain things back. I'm just saying they have historical connotations which are very negative. So there you go. All right. So grandfather clauses exempt poor white guys from, sorry for scrolling there, from the things that poor black guys have to be subjected to. Okay, now if you were wondering, do guys in the North want black guys voting? Absolutely. Is it because they're more wholesome and pure and less racist than guys in the South? Probably not. Is it because they think black guys in the South will vote the same way as white guys in the North? Yes, that's it. They think black guys in the South will vote for Republicans, which is more of a northern party during this time period. And so it will help them in elections, in national elections, if black guys get to vote. Not trying to be 100% cynical, but at least 50% cynical is probably fair on this. Now, if you're wondering, did they harass black guys in the North the same way that black guys in the South got harassed? Yeah, they did. But the difference is almost all the black guys, people, African Americans, during this time period live in the South, because that's just where the African American population had traditionally been. And, you know, that of course originates with slavery. And if you're wondering to yourself, well, why the heck don't you get out of the South after slavery ends? You know the answer. It's because you're broke, because moving's expensive. If you're not sure about that, you know, wait a year or two until you move somewhere, or just ask your parents. Moving is really expensive. So, and while you didn't have to have first and last month's rent maybe during this time period, you did have to have money to go somewhere, which is, yeah, going to be really expensive during this time period. So, most black guys stay in the South after slavery ends. And so most of the discrimination against African Americans is in the South. If you study this pretty intensely, you'll notice that there are race riots and ways to prevent African Americans from voting in the North as well. But the numbers and instances of those things are smaller because the black population in the North is substantially small. You'll also notice, if you study it into the 20th century, that when there are communities of color in the Midwest or the North that become very prosperous, people get upset about it and often go and loot them or burn them down. So you see that in Waco, you see that in Tulsa, you'll see it in Chicago, you'll see it in New York City. So it's not just a Southern thing, but many more instances of these types of things happen in the South because the black population in the South is larger. I would love to tell you that somewhere in the United States, there's a whole bunch of rational, egalitarian types of folks who think everybody's equal. There are pockets of those folks. And thankfully for us historically, almost all the people who felt that way, who had political power, seemed to come to power during this time period. So the people who run the Republican Party, people like Abraham Lincoln and Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens, and the abolitionists like Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison and others, they really do think blacks and whites are equal and should have equal rights. And that group of people, they have a lot of power. But the general population doesn't necessarily think that. And there are handful of churches that think that and are really behind the abolition movement and supportive of the Civil War. Quakers are supportive of the abolition movement. They're not supportive of any war, so they're consistent. But if you're wondering, like, is the North wholesome and pure on racial stuff? Nah, not really. Not really. Sorry. Okay. Oh, and your book talks about, there's a little section, it's an interesting little quirky group of folks who live in western Kansas, where nobody is, it's just a bunch of farms. But they just like beg African Americans, former slaves, to come there, and they give them free land. Exodusters is what they call the group of people that go there, because they exodus from the South, but they end up in a fairly dusty part of western Kansas. But those people aren't fooling around. They really do think blacks and whites are equal, and they put their money behind their beliefs and give away land and that sort of stuff. But in general, no, people are still a little prejudiced during this time period, or a lot prejudiced during this time period. All right, so we had black codes, which were similar to slave codes. We talked about all that. Okay. The North does want African Americans to vote in the South, but they really want them to stay in the South as well. The KKK is developed during this time period. I always assume people are familiar with the KKK, not because it's around or you're members of it or anything like that, but because it's just notorious and, you know, white robes and stuff. So, and it is a fairly Southern thing. Not saying it doesn't exist in the Midwest. And when it becomes politically prominent in the 20th century, most of the leaders of the KKK are from Indiana and Illinois, that sort of thing, but develops in Georgia, and it's a very Southern thing. The part of their initial goal is to keep African Americans, former slaves, from voting, and they'll do that by intimidation, force, they'll kill people. So the Congress is going to pass laws called the Enforcement Acts, or the nicknames are the Force Act or the KKK Acts, which allow the 5 military governors of those 5 different regions to call in the troops to protect voters during national elections. And that'll happen a lot during the Johnson administration and during the first grant administration. Okay. All right, so I need to talk about impeachment here in a minute, but I want to stop for a second and see if you guys have any questions. Is there anything you want to ask? And I'll look for the hand raising thing. I'm intrigued by that. I'm sure I must have known that. So I haven't been on the participant side of a Zoom meeting where I raised my hand. I think I gave somebody a thumbs up once. All right, we'll keep going then. So Johnson is not impressed by any like the Force Acts or Civil Rights Act or adding funding to the Freedmen's Bureau, a lot of the laws that the Congress passes. So he tends to veto them, and then Congress tends to override those vetoes. So there's this constant clash between Johnson and the Congress. So at a certain point, Congress just says, you know, we're tired of this dude. Let's just get him out of here. So let's impeach him. And maybe you're wondering, well, have they tried to impeach a president before? No, they have not tried to impeach a president before. They have impeached federal judges before. They impeached a Judge Thomas Pickering back in the Jefferson presidency, but that's because he went to work drunk, which is a bad idea. Yeah, just trust me, it's a bad idea. I've never done it. I'm saying trust me for that reason. But they also tried to impeach a guy named Samuel Chase because he had a different philosophy than the party in power, and they were unsuccessful at that because he was just thought differently and he didn't do anything wrong. Now, the problem with Johnson is he's super annoying. He vetoes all their legislation. He even goes to Congress sometimes and cusses them out, but he doesn't break any laws. So you can't impeach a guy unless, you know, he could show up drunk at work or break a law. So they decide to make a law that they know he will break, which is clever if you think about it, but pretty unethical, but clever. So they passed something called the Tenure, Tenure. Let me highlight it a little bit here, if I can. Tenure of Office Act. The Tenure of Office Act says that if you have a job where the Senate had to approve you to get that job, so you had to be confirmed by the Senate, which is normally just a federally appointed job. So Supreme Court Justice, Federal Court Justice, cabinet member, that sort of thing. Then to get fired from that job, the Senate also has to agree to that. Now, that is likely unconstitutional. I would say that it is because, you know, the Constitution doesn't discuss that. You're adding to it. So likely unconstitutional. So Congress writes that bill because Andrew Johnson has said he is going to fire Edwin Stanton, who is Abraham Lincoln's former Secretary of War, which now we would call Secretary of Defense. But he wants to impeach this guy. And Congress says, hey, he's going to impeach that guy, or not impeach him. He's going to fire that guy, excuse me. So let's make it illegal for him to fire Edwin Stanton. So that's what they do, Tenure of Office Act. And so they pass it. Andrew Johnson says clearly unconstitutional, vetoes it. They override his veto. He fires Edwin Stanton, and then they go, woohoo, let's impeach the dude. So they bring articles of impeachment against Andrew Johnson. So the House, the way that impeachment works is the House has to decide if you're going to bring articles of impeachment. So they're like a grand jury to see if they want to have an indictment. Like, is there enough evidence here to charge him with the crime of whatever so we can impeach him, high crime or misdemeanor. So the House goes through and says, yes, there's enough evidence to do this. So they charge him with a high crime or misdemeanor. And then the Senate hosts the trial. And I know you haven't had the government class yet, probably, but I don't know if you think a lot about the difference of the two houses in Congress. Probably spend most of your waking hours thinking, how's the House different from the Senate? But The guys in the House, people in the House, have 2-year terms. So everyone in the House is up for re-election every 2 years. So those guys always have to make a name for themselves. So they're always doing crazy stuff so that you'll notice them. They're sort of like ninth graders. You know, they don't have a whole lot of sense. They don't think they can get any trouble. They want to make sure that you notice them. So they're just out of control. So anything that happens is kind of radical or weird usually happens in the House. The Senate, those guys are there for 6 years. So a third of the Senate is up for re-election every 2 years. Those guys, there's fewer of them, so they essentially have more power. And their goal in a lot of ways is just to keep their job. So they do not want to rock the boat. They don't necessarily want to get noticed because you probably just vote them back in because it's like, I don't remember him doing anything crazy, so he must be all right. So senators tend to get reelected for a very long time, and they tend to be there a very long time. And one of your goals usually in the House is to become a senator. So the Senate tends to want to keep their job, do less radical things. So they are truly a conservative group. And by conservative, I don't mean they're a bunch of Republicans. I mean, they are less likely to do stuff that looks a little crazy because they just want to seem reasonable, rational, sensible. They don't want to lose their jobs. So the House is almost always willing to impeach. It's like, yeah, people will notice us. We impeach people. We took a stand. We were tough. Woohoo. The Senate pretty typically will look at what the House did and go like, those guys are out of control. We really don't want to impeach somebody. So, because it's too much. In this instance, people were tired of Andrew Johnson. There's no doubt. And he was super annoying. No doubt about that either. But the Senate Republicans, which was by far the majority, way over 2/3, which is what you need to impeach. You need 2/3. Way over 2/3 of the Senate, it's like 6 people over 2/3, were Republicans. So if they just voted on party lines, we would have kicked Andrew Johnson out of the presidency. But the Senate impeachment managers spoke with Andrew Johnson's lawyers, and they said, look, Andrew Johnson's term's almost over. He's going to calm down and stuff. So if he calms down, will you agree not to impeach him? And they said, yeah, that's fine with us. So I think it was 6 of them agreed not to vote to kick him out of office. So Andrew Johnson gets impeached, but not convicted. So there's no consequence for him. He doesn't get kicked out of office. He does make it through the whole impeachment process, which is, bringing the articles of impeachment and the trial in the Senate. But the Senate votes against convicting or kicking him out of office. And the last 6 or 8 months of his term are pretty quiet. There's no more dramatic stuff that happened. However, it's important in some ways because it does show that impeachment should not be used for purely political reasons. And most people who kind of objectively look at impeachment will suggest to you that the times that it was probably more political than legislative, that it didn't work. The one time so far where there probably was a fairly serious violation of law was the Nixon administration, and that may have worked in some ways, close to how it was intended. He doesn't get impeached. They don't make it through the whole process because he resigns before they do. And if you're wondering too, like how many presidents were impeached? Well, Johnson, Nixon kind of halfway, and then Clinton. And then, they added Trump to your new chapter in this book. So we're going to talk about Trump's version of impeachment as well, which is kind of Trump. He's always making history. Interesting dude. All right. So Johnson impeached but not convicted. Now, do any of you think Johnson will be running for another term? Does anybody think Johnson's great success as president? So
Not really.
Yeah, and does he even have a political party at this point?
No, they kind of just left him.
Yeah, because he had been what they called the Constitutional Union Party, which was just for fun for Lincoln. Lincoln was clearly a Republican. Most of the North is Republican. The South is Democrats, but the South isn't getting to vote really in as meaningful a way. And the Democrats wouldn't want him anyway. He's too controversial. And he doesn't want to be president again either. So he's out. So they end up, you know what? I don't even know. This is terrible, but I don't even know who runs for president as a Democrat against Grant, because Grant wins. I just don't know. Could look it up, but I don't know or really care. Sorry if that was one of your relatives that ran against Grant. But Ulysses S. Grant runs as a Republican, and we'll vote for him because he's Ulysses S. Grant. You know, he's a Civil War hero, and he will get elected to 2 terms. Now, next class, we'll talk about Grant's presidencies. And I know you're thinking, how in the world is she going to talk about that and talk about how Reconstruction is either success or failure in an hour? Because we're not going to talk about Grant very much. Because, I mean, I know he gets 8 years, but we just, historically, we don't care as much about him as president as we do about him as Civil War general. And Grant, I don't know, we'll talk about it next time, and you'll see it. Grant's presidency, for our purposes, we'll go through it pretty quickly. And probably what's most important is the election after Grant's and ending Reconstruction. So, all right, I'm back looking at some of your faces, and somebody wants to go to Texas Tech. I don't know, Texas Tech? It's probably all right. My niece went there. My brother-in-law went there. It's windy, I know that. I've seen the campus. I went for my niece's graduation. It's lovely. And I don't even know what that is. That scary looking face thing. All right, so, and somebody has a sunset, that's nice. All right, before we go, do you guys have any questions you want to ask? Your high school teachers make you show your face all the time, don't they? I should do that. I want to see your face.
I look lovely.
Yes,
I forgot my question. Never mind.
it's all right. If you think of it, you know, we still have a few minutes.
Actually, I do have one question.
All
So
right,
the
let's,
so I kind of forgot about so this didn't get passed, but what was the 10% plan again? It
oh,
was,
that was,
okay, just go.
you're good.
No,
That
I'm
was,
sorry.
no, you're
I'm
fine.
sorry.
That was Lincoln saying that if 10% of the eligible voters pledged to be loyal to the Union moving forward, then their state could have elections. And the
And
South
then,
thought that was too lenient.
so then they upgraded it to like 50%?
Yeah, and they also had to say they'd never voluntarily supported the Confederacy, which would be a lie, probably.
Okay.
Yeah.
I had a question. What was the one thing that they wanted to do where it was basically that they couldn't vote until the next generation?
That would be the Wade Davis or the 50% plan, because you're
Oh,
asking,
okay.
yeah, you're asking the voters to say that they never voluntarily supported the Confederacy. And pretty much most of the people who had voted before the Civil War did voluntarily support the Confederacy in the South. So until you get a new generation of voters who hadn't, you know, have the option, then yeah, you probably weren't going to be able to vote again. All right. You guys,
Thanks.
you're welcome. Do you guys have other questions or comments?
What was the difference between a pocket veto and a veto?
Oh, pocket veto can only happen in the last 2 weeks of a legislative session. And it's an automatic veto if you don't sign a bill. You don't have to like say, you know, stamp, I vetoed the bill. You just kind of let it quietly die. If you do that during the legislative session, like not the last 2 weeks, then it becomes the law. It hardly ever happens. It's a really rare thing. Because usually the president will do an in-your-face veto just to, you know, for emphasis. Like I'm sure any of our last, well, either Obama or Trump, they would have done an in-your-face veto. That's who they are.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Maybe George Bush would have done the quiet veto. I don't know. Kinder, gentler veto. But yeah, you can only do the pocket veto at the end of a legislative session. Sorry, I'm playing with my ice pack. Let me set it down. All right. Any other questions or comments before you go? All right. It was lovely to see you. So next time we'll talk about whether reconstruction was a success or failure. If you want to ask a question, you can stay on and ask. I'll try to post this. Oh yeah, I got to stop the recording.